The stale scent of chalk, dust, and floor wax clung to Alistair Finch like a second skin. It was the smell of resignation, of 30 years spent diagramming sentences and dissecting frost for rows of increasingly vacant faces. At 62, Alistair was a relic, a man out of time in the gleaming, sterile halls of Northgate Preparatory Academy. His tweed jackets were frayed at the elbows, his glasses perpetually smudged, and his voice, once resonant with a passion for literature, had worn down to a soft, apologetic murmur. The other teachers, younger and sharper in their business-casual attire, spoke of engagement metrics and digital integration in the staff lounge. They nodded politely when Alistair entered, their eyes glazing over as if he were a ghost from a bygone educational era. They saw a man fading into irrelevance, a gentle but ineffective fossil who couldn't command the respect of children born with smartphones in their hands. The students saw something simpler, a target. Or rather, they saw the weakness in him as an open invitation to prey on those even weaker than themselves. His crisis was not a sudden, explosive event, but a slow, grinding erosion of decency that he witnessed every day. It centered on a boy named Leo, a wisp of a freshman with ink-stained fingers and eyes that held the bewildered sadness of a stray animal. Leo was an artist, his notebooks filled with fantastical creatures and soaring, impossible landscapes drawn with a skill that belied his age. He was quiet, gentle, and utterly alone, which made him perfect prey for Caden Thorne and his two shadows. Alistair would see it in the hallways between classes. A deliberate shoulder check that sent Leo's books scattering, a whispered venomous comment that made the boy flinch and curl into himself. Alistair would try to intervene, his voice a reedy counterpoint to the boisterous cruelty. "That's enough, Mr. Thorne," he would say, and Caden would offer a lazy, insolent smirk. "Just having fun, Mr. Finch?" he'd drawl, the title dripping with condescension. The humiliation was twofold, Leo's and Alistair's. He was a figure of authority they simply didn't recognize. The school, in its pursuit of prestige and funding, had become a place where the currency of respect was not earned through character but inherited through wealth and influence. And Alistair Finch had none. He felt the weight of his own powerlessness, a quiet, aching hollowness in his chest as he watched Leo navigate the corridors like a soldier moving through a minefield. The silence of the other students was a deafening accomplice, their averted gazes a testament to their fear. This was the landscape of his failure not just as a teacher but as a man. He was ignored, dismissed, and in the cold, transactional ecosystem of Northgate Prep, he and the boy he tried to protect were equally invisible. The conflict sharpened into a cruel point in the library, a place Alistair still considered a sanctuary. Caden Thorne and his acolytes, Mason and Cole, had cornered Leo near the graphic novel section. They weren't being loud. Their malice was a low, conspiratorial hum that was somehow more menacing than a shout. Alistair, returning a stack of poetry anthologies, saw the scene unfold. Caden held Leo's sketchbook, its pages filled with the boy's intricate drawings, and was flipping through it with theatrical disdain. "What is all this freakish garbage?" Caden sneered, his voice loud enough for the half-dozen other students in the vicinity to hear. Mason and Cole snickered on cue. Leo stood rigid, his face pale, his hands clenched into small, trembling fists. He didn't plead or cry. He just watched, his expression one of profound violation as Caden's grimy thumb smeared the graphite of a detailed dragon. "My dad says art is what you do when you can't do anything real," Caden continued, tearing a page out with a soft, deliberate rip that echoed in the hallowed silence of the library. The sound was like a bone snapping. Alistair felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. He set his books down quietly and walked toward them, his worn leather shoes making no sound on the polished floor. "Mr. Thorne," Alistair said, his voice low but firm, "that book is personal property. Give it back to him." Now Caden turned slowly, his face a mask of arrogant surprise, as if a piece of furniture had just spoken to him. "Stay out of this, Finch," he said, dropping the honorific. "This has nothing to do with you." He held the torn page up, crumpling it into a tight ball. Just cleaning up some trash the other students pretended to read, their heads buried in their books, their bodies radiating a desperate desire to be somewhere else. Even the librarian, Mrs. Gable, merely peered over her computer monitor before looking away, her fear of Caden's influential father overriding her duty. Caden's father, a real estate tycoon, was the head of the school board and its most generous benefactor. His son moved through the school wrapped in a cocoon of impunity. "What are you going to do?" Caden taunted, taking a step toward Alistair, a head taller and 30 years younger. "Give me detention? My father owns the building you work in." The threat was plain, the power dynamic brutally clear. Alistair stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, but he felt the familiar sting of impotence. He was a shepherd with a broken staff, facing down a wolf who knew the shepherd's master would never punish him. That evening, the silence of Alistair's small, meticulously kept house seemed to press in on him. It was a silence he had grown accustomed to since Martha passed, a silence once filled with her easy laughter and the warm scent of her baking. Now it only amplified the echoes of his own inadequacies. He sat in his worn armchair, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold on the side table, the book in his lap unread. He saw not the printed words, but the image of that crumpled page, of Leo's shattered expression. In a dusty box in the back of his closet, beneath a stack of old photograph albums, was a dress blue uniform, neatly folded. The medals pinned to the chest were tarnished with age, symbols of a life he never spoke of. He had been a different man then, a man who understood command and consequence, a man who had made promises in the searing heat and dust of places a world away from Northgate Prep. He had promised his men he would have their backs. He had promised Martha, when he'd returned, that he would dedicate his life to building things up instead of tearing them down. Teaching had seemed like the most noble way to do that. He had believed in the power of words to shape character, to forge empathy, to build moral courage. But the world he had found in the polished halls of the academy was governed by a different code, one of power, privilege, and a casual cruelty he had not anticipated. His quiet strength, honed in crucibles Caden Thorne couldn't even imagine, was perceived here as weakness. His restraint was seen as fear. He had made a promise to Martha on her deathbed, his hand holding hers as her warmth faded. "Look after the quiet ones, Alistair," she had whispered, her voice a fragile thread. The world is too loud for them. He was failing her. He was failing Leo. He ran a hand over his tired face, the tweed of his jacket rough against his skin. The jacket had been his father's, a professor of classics who believed in stoicism and duty. Alistair had worn it every day since his first day of teaching, a threadbare piece of armor against a world he increasingly didn't understand. He felt the weight of all those promises, of the man he used to be and the man he was supposed to be. Tonight that weight was crushing. He was not a fighter anymore, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not retreat. The pressure mounted over the next week, becoming a palpable, suffocating force. Caden, emboldened by Alistair's public powerlessness, escalated his campaign against Leo. It was no longer confined to whispers and shoves. One morning, Leo arrived to find his locker spray-painted with a crude, vicious caricature of one of his fantasy creatures, the word "freak" scrawled beneath it in garish red letters. Another day, his art portfolio, left for a moment on a lunch table, was found submerged in a trash can full of greasy water. The pages warped and the ink bled into meaningless, muddy swirls. Each incident was a public spectacle, performed for a silent, captive audience of students who watched with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. They said nothing. They did nothing. Their silence was a form of consent, a collective turning away that isolated Leo and Alistair even further. Alistair reported each incident to Principal Thompson, a man whose spine seemed to be made of gelatin. Thompson would listen with a pained expression, wringing his hands and speaking in platitudes about unfortunate adolescent behavior and the need for conflict resolution, but his eyes always darted away, and his words were hollow. After the portfolio was destroyed, Thompson called Alistair into his office. "Alistair," he began, his tone oozing a false sympathy. "I understand your concern, but you must see the delicate nature of this situation. Mr. Thorne is a significant contributor to our school's future. Perhaps Leo is being a bit too sensitive? Maybe you could advise him to not draw so much attention to himself." The suggestion was so obscene, so morally bankrupt, that Alistair was momentarily speechless. He was being told to counsel the victim on how to be less of a target. He walked out of the office feeling a cold rage he hadn't experienced in decades. The other teachers were no better. In the staff lounge, they would change the subject when he approached. One, a history teacher named Mr. Davies, pulled him aside. "Listen, Alistair, for your own good, just drop it," he advised in a low voice. "You're not going to win this. Thorne's kid is untouchable. You're putting your own job on the line for a boy who will be gone in 4 years. The warning was meant to be friendly, but it felt like another betrayal. He was utterly alone, a solitary lighthouse keeper on a rock, watching a storm gather and knowing no help was coming. He endured the condescending looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the crushing weight of a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The breaking point arrived on a gray, overcast Friday afternoon. The final bell had rung, and the school was emptying out, students pouring into the parking lot with the boisterous energy of the newly freed. Alistair was tidying his classroom when a flicker of movement in the courtyard below caught his eye. He saw Leo hurrying toward the side gate, his backpack slung over one shoulder. And then he saw them. Caden, Mason, and Cole, cutting him off, moving with the predatory confidence of a pack of jackals cornering their prey. They backed him against the cold brick wall of the gymnasium. Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't hesitate. He left his books scattered on his desk and moved faster than he had in years, his footsteps echoing in the deserted hallway. He burst through the side doors into the damp, chilly air just as Caden knocked Leo's backpack from his shoulder. Its contents spilled across the pavement, books, pens, and a half-finished sketch of a griffin. Caden held a large, full cup of soda, a dark, syrupy concoction he'd been nursing. "You know, freak," Caden sneered, his voice carrying in the quiet courtyard. "My dad says people like you need to be taught a lesson about the real world." He made a move to douse Leo with the sticky liquid. In that split second, Alistair moved. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply stepped between the two boys, his back to Caden, facing Leo. He placed a gentle hand on Leo's shoulder, a silent, unmovable shield. "Go on home, Leo," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Caden, enraged by the sudden, defiant intervention, snarled. "Get out of the way, old man." He shoved Alistair hard in the back. The unexpected force sent Alistair stumbling forward. His glasses flew from his face and skittered across the concrete, one lens cracking with a sickening little pop. But he regained his footing and didn't turn around. He remained in front of Leo, a frail but absolute barrier. Thwarted and furious, Caden let out a guttural yell and hurled the entire cup. The dark, cold liquid exploded against Alistair's back, soaking through his tweed jacket and shirt, the sticky soda dripping down his neck and into his graying hair. Ice cubes clattered to the ground around his feet. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, absorbing the humiliation, the cold, the sticky mess, his gaze fixed on the pale, terrified face of the boy behind him. The tableau held for a long, silent moment. The few dozen students who had lingered to watch the confrontation were frozen, their jeers and laughter dying in their throats. They had expected the old teacher to crumble, to scold impotently, to be dismissed. They had not expected this. They had not expected him to take the blow, to willingly accept the degradation meant for someone else. In his stillness, in his quiet absorption of their cruelty, Alistair Finch projected a strength they had never seen before. It wasn't the strength of muscle or threat, but a deeper, more resilient kind of power. It was the strength of absolute conviction. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. A girl who had laughed at Caden's jokes a moment before now looked down at her shoes, her face flushed with shame. A younger teacher, Miss Albright, who was walking to her car, stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth slightly agape. She saw not a pathetic old man, but